Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. So, Diablo Server Slam has been going on for a little while, and I've had a chance to test out the patch changes. And of course, by the time the game actually launches, we're probably going to see a lot of changes, between now and then, and that's perfectly fine. But what I wanted to do today was I wanted to do little character overviews on each of the characters. Obviously, I have the Necromancer, the Druid, the Sorceress, and the Barbarian. I did a Barbarian last beta as well, and of course, I did one of every single character. I did two Druids. And I've got a lot of wealth of information to go over, so I figured we could talk about my boy the Druid here. So I think this is the first one we're going to start with, and we'll lead into the others a little bit later. So the Druid is an interesting class. Has a lot of variation that he can do. Unlike, a melee class, which is almost strictly melee, or a range class, which is almost strictly ranged, or a caster class, which is almost strictly caster, this particular character seems to be more or less a little bit of everything. If we start with the basic skills, the first thing we have is a clearly werebear skill called Maul, which does a pretty decent amount of damage to enemies in front of you. It's kind of like a little AoE, a little frontal AoE attack. Maul is basically just your starter ability. And in fact, that's really the kind of the thing about a lot of these starter abilities is that they are just simply starter abilities. They're not really super duper amazing, and you may not even invest that many points into them. Claw is definitely your werewolf skill, so you get to start out as a werewolf or a werebear. And Claw can be kind of like a nice melee attack, or it can even be a poisoning attack, depending on which way you want to go. I actually did a Poison Wolf last beta, and it was pretty cool. Storm Strike is a melee attack as well that basically is just like a lightning bonk. So you basically have three melee attacks here. You've got a werebear melee attack, you've got a werewolf melee attack, and then you have a regular druid melee attack that you use when you're in druid form. And this one has some pretty decent like immobilizations as well as vulnerabilities, and you can also set it up to hit more targets. It generally tends to be pretty good though for just about any like melee druid, because it has that really nice immobilize, the vulnerability, and then it also generates damage reduction. So you gain 25% damage reduction for 3 seconds after dealing damage with Storm Strike. So as long as you're bonking things with this ability, you tend to be a little tankier. We also have Wind Shear, which is more of a caster ability, ranged of course, and you conjure little blades of wind, and it does make the enemies vulnerable, which is kind of nice. You can set it up to generate extra spirit, or you can set it up so that it increases your movement speed. It's basically a wind ability, right? And then finally we have our Earth Spike, and Earth Spike actually just kind of comes right up underneath the ground and hits them like no matter where they are. So it doesn't have any travel time. It literally just comes out of the ground, and definitely the Earth caster skill. This one seems to be based around stunning the enemy. It also has some immobilizations, gives you some fortify as well, which is pretty interesting. And in general, the whole basic tree is literally just kind of like what you would prefer. It really doesn't matter a whole lot which one you pick, even if you're going down a specific tree. Even if you're a werewolf and you want to pick the werebear skill, or even if you're like a wind druid and you want to pick the earth skill, like whatever works out for your build, it's really all that matters for these basic skills. They're really just generators. They generate your abilities and the resource for your class, and they have some slight other uses as well. But you may not be using these all of the time, because you might have other ways to generate resource. Then we move on to the core skills, and in the core skills we do have some passives, so they give you some max spirit, some basic skills to regeneration, and they also give you the wild impulses, which adds to the spirit. Core skills cost more spirit but increase damage, so it boosts up the amount of spirit that they cost. Starting with Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm seems to be based around making the monsters immobilized, and it hits multiple targets at a time. So basically what Immobilize does is you kind of like hold down the button, and like lightning just kind of like rains down from the sky, striking nearby targets, dishing out a pretty decent amount of damage. It's actually not too bad. It hits up to like 5 times at once, and it's decent. It does kind of feel like you have to be kind of in there to actually get the lightning strikes to hit the target, so almost feels a little bit like Hurricane on Diablo 2, where you kind of have to stand close. We also have Tornado, which is obviously straight from Diablo 2 as well, and obviously shoots out some little tornadoes and dish out some damage. The tornado does have some slowing effects as well as a chance to spawn additional tornadoes. And then we also have the vulnerability that comes from that. The tornadoes is just another casting ability, so it goes along with the wind shear if you want to go full wind. Then we have our two shape-shifted forms. So pulverize is for our werebear, and obviously it's going to turn you into the werebear when you shapeshift. And you get an overpower every 12 seconds with pulverize, which is pretty darn cool. So this actually allows you to get a free huge boost of damage, depending on like your level of health and fortify, because overpower damage is based on your health and fortify. And so if you're building up large amounts of health and fortify, and you have this free overpower, you're gonna get a pretty nice spike damage hit, thanks to enhanced pulverize. It also gives you enemies overpowered by pulverize or stunned. Or you can go into the pulverized 20% damage reduction for 4 seconds. Then we have Shred. Now, Shred is definitely a werewolf ability. It's a mobility ability as well, because you dash toward the target. And this allows you to close gaps, which is pretty nice. The attack and heal on this is actually pretty nice. So you get 30% increased attack speed, and it heals for 1% of your maximum life if an enemy is struck. And then you also can set it up as a poison ability, or you can move into more critical strike damage on the third attack. This ability is actually pretty good for the werewolf, and if you're going to do a werewolf druid, I would definitely take a look at Shred. I spent a lot of time playing around with Shred as a poison wolf, and it definitely was worth using. I also used Claw quite a bit on my poison wolf, which was nice. We also have this one here, which is very nice. It's critical strike chance close against close enemies. So we discovered that close enemies is basically just, enemies that are very close to you. So melee range is what that means. And so having a 6% crit strike increase against all enemies that are close to you is actually pretty sweet. Then we have the movement speed increase while in werewolf form, and then finally the damage reduction while in werebear form, because they want the werebear to be a tankier form and the werewolf to be a faster form. And then finally is the Earth skill. So the Earth skill is Landslide. Landslide is pretty interesting. It's basically two pillars that come out and try and crush the target. I mean, it literally looks like two fists coming together and smashing the target in between them. And basically, the Landslide ability does have quite a few buffs that you can get that increase the number of attacks and the number of pillars and things like that, which is pretty cool. It does a pretty decent amount of damage, but more importantly is it just kind of appears underneath of the target, so you don't actually have to be anywhere near the target to actually dish out damage. And in this way, if you're using the Earth Spike and the Landslide ability together, there's no travel distance, there's no worrying about like getting over to the target. Like, the ability just appears directly underneath of their butt and just starts damaging them, which is kind of a fun way to play a character, because it just not having to worry about travel time and trajectories of your missiles and all that other stuff can be an interesting way to play as well. The enhanced Landslide also has the immobilization, and then when you immobilize, it also has some bonuses as well. And then when you strike an immobilized target with Landslide, an additional pillar is formed. The Earth Tree tends to be a really heavily into the immobilizations, the stuns, things like that. And as I played the Earth Druid back on the beta, what I came across was that the Earth Druid just has tons of CC, tons of crowd control. So if you're going to go with a crowd control build, if you want to do a crowd control build, the Earth Druid is pretty sweet with that. Moving on to the next tree is the defensive skills. And it's also important to note that the defensive skills actually shares items with several other classes. So if any class has a defensive skill tree, then the defensive skill tree is going to work across the board. So for instance, let's say I found an amulet that has defensive skills, +1 defensive skills. It's going to work on any of the classes that have a defensive skills tree, which is pretty interesting. So first off is our Earthen Bulwark. And Earthen Bulwark basically lasts 3 seconds, puts a big old rock barrier around you for 54% of your life, which is actually pretty useful. And you can also set it up to make you unstoppable, which is basically, like your form cannot be frozen from Diablo 2, like makes it so that you can break free of crowd controls. And then, of course, you also have the ability to either make it dish out damage, or you can make it grant you base life as Fortify, which is pretty nice. It's a very good defensive ability. And in general, it definitely works very well. There's a couple legendaries you can get to increase the duration and the effectiveness of Earthen Bulwark, and overall, it's probably one of my favorite defensive abilities on this tree. Second is the Cyclone Armor. So Cyclone Armor is basically like the Diablo 2 counterpart, except a little nerfed. So in Diablo 2, it used to completely absorb elemental damage up to a certain amount. Now it just simply applies resistance. So it applies a huge amount of non-physical damage reduction to your character. And on top of that, you can also get an active effect, which knocks enemies back and slows them. And then you can even make it so that it has the enemies become vulnerable. Or you can have it so that every 10 seconds it intensifies and causes incoming damage to grant you 30% damage reduction for 2 seconds. Now, there are some pretty cool legendaries for Cyclone Armor, like the ability to make it affect everyone in your group, including your minions, as well as apply physical damage reduction on top of the non-physical damage reduction, which makes it a pretty tanky little effect. And in fact, because it's passive, it actually works really good as a one-point wonder for a lot of builds, just to throw something in there extra if you're struggling with resistances, things like that. In fact, finding an item with it on there is also useful, because then you don't have to put a point into it. They did nerf it pretty heavily. About half effectiveness. It used to be around 20% non-physical damage reduction. Now it's only 10. But you can get it pretty high if you level it up. Next is the Blood Howl ability, and I wouldn't necessarily call this one defensive so much as offensive, because in my experience with the ability, it definitely is more of an offensive ability than a defensive, but it does have a heal. It heals you for 20% of your maximum life, which is why I can see why it's classified as defensive. However, it also has the ability to add attack speed, 15% attack speed for 4 seconds, which is very offensive. It also has the Blood Howl generates 20 spirit, which is very nice for offensive use. So either way you go here. There's also a pretty nice legendary, which adds in even more offensive capability and allows you to apply the Blood Howl to basically everybody nearby, including your companions, which is pretty darn cool. I actually had a lot of fun with that legendary. Debilitating Roar lets you shapeshift into a werebear, and you do a big mighty roar, reducing the damage dealt of all monsters nearby for 4 seconds, which is pretty cool. Then you can beef it up, and you can have it fortify you for your 22% of your base life, and then on top of that, you can also slow enemies, or you can choose to heal yourself for 4% of your maximum life for each second of its duration, which is pretty darn cool. So, I mean, you're talking about a very tanky defensive ability for the werebear. And obviously, if you're running werebear specifically, you might just want to grab this anyway, because you're a big bear. We also got increased your non-physical resistances by 5%, which is definitely nice. And then on top of that, we also have Vigilance, which you gain 5% damage reduction for 6 seconds after using any defensive skill. So as you can see here, there's a lot of ways that you can make your Druid more tanky, and I never really had much of an issue with Druid tankiness. Next on the list is the companion skills, and these are really fun. So let's talk about these. First, let's go over the passive. So it's actually really interesting. You might notice here that I only have 1 point in the Raven, and only 1 point in the Poison Creeper, and only 1 point in the Wolves. But that's because there's this pretty sweet passive here that increases the amount of damage that the companions deal by a pretty huge portion. And I actually found that putting points in this was actually better than putting points in the actual raw skill, because this gives more damage than the skill does, which is pretty crazy. So instead of investing points directly into the Poison Creeper, or directly into the Ravens, or directly into the Wolves, I figured out that putting points into Call of Wild was actually more effective. Because not only did it increase the damage of the Ravens, for instance, but it also increased the damage of the Poison Creeper and the Wolves, and it did it better than the points in the skill itself. And to demonstrate that, I can always take a point out here and show you what I mean. So the Ravens currently have, 840 active damage, right? So if I put a point in there, they go to 917. Take the point out, put the point back in here, they go to... What is going on? Do I not have any money? I has money. I's got the money. Oh, I see what's going on. So when I throw the point into the ability itself, you'll see it goes up to... Of course it's not doing it, is it? Why is it not doing it? I swear I tested this before, and it worked absolutely perfectly last time. Showed the physical damage increase on the skill. And this time it doesn't want to. But basically, this one actually helps out these a little bit more, which is actually pretty nice. But let's talk about the abilities themselves. I'm getting off on a tangent. So ravens are very nice damage output, and they basically can be swarmed on the target. They dish out a mediocre amount of damage, like passively, but if you actually use them, they swarm to the target, and they have some pretty amazing effects. So they're going to come down, they're going to swarm on the target for 6 seconds, and you can set it up so you can have 5% increased critical strike for 6 seconds, which is absolutely excellent, even if you're like a melee class or something, which makes them pretty much a no-brainer for a lot of classes, especially if you're running crit. And then on top of that, you can also have them attack more often, or you can have any monsters inside the ravens become vulnerable for 3 seconds. So not only do they gain a 5% crit chance, but they also become vulnerable whenever you use the ravens on the target, which makes them pretty darn sweet, even if you're just going to 1-point wonder them. Then, of course, we have the gain 2 spirit when transforming into the human form. And then this one is the deal 3% increased to distant enemies. So what we found out is that distant enemies is literally just any enemy that's like really far away from you. And double this bonus if they are also slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knocked back, which, as we just talked about, like the Earth Druid and several other classes, including like the Lightning Druid, tend to have a lot of slows and immobilized and stuns. So that would be a 6% increase versus those monsters times 3. So 6, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So about an 18% damage increase for Nature's Freeze. Poison Creeper is also really interesting. So Poison Creeper does a modicum amount of poison damage or passive damage to all targets nearby, but it also does a pretty massive amount of poison damage when you activate it. Now, it doesn't last that long when you activate it. It's only 3 seconds, and you can beef that up by a couple extra seconds with the poisoning duration here, the Ferocious Poison Creeper. You can also grab the immobilized duration increase of 1 second, but there's also another one here, which is your critical strike damage is increased by 20% against enemies strangled by the Poison Creeper. So as you can see, between the Ravens with a 5% crit over 6 seconds and the Poison Creeper, which gives you a 20%, you could potentially hit some targets pretty dang hard utilizing these two skills. And honestly, I think the Ravens or the Poison Creeper, or maybe even both, is a good addition to pretty much any build. Moving on to the Wrath skills. The Wrath skills include basically a huge swath of passives. So you've got Earth passives that can do some pretty good increase to those. We also have a huge amount of elemental, basically lightning and wind passives. And the interesting thing about these is there's some pretty cool stuff in here, like chances for lightning bolts to hit random targets, like making the monsters immobilized. Like if the target is immobilized, like you can get some pretty interesting builds going on with the kind of like the crazy things that are inside these passives. And we also have Hurricane, which is on a cooldown of 20 seconds and lasts for 8, so you can't keep it up all the time, which is a little disappointing. But it basically just hits every target around you. It could be useful for a melee character or a caster because technically, like you're in there fighting. So if you're using Hurricane on a regular basis, then it's going to just hit all the targets around you on a regular basis. You can also set up Hurricane to slow targets by 25%. And then you can also set it up to make the enemies vulnerable as well. Or you can reduce the amount of damage that they do, turning it into sort of a defensive cooldown, which is pretty cool. Boulder is kind of like a downgraded Molten Boulder, because it's no longer molten. But it basically functions very similarly to Molten Boulder in Diablo 2, and you basically throw a Molten Boulder, or a boulder at people, and it knocks them back. It can be enhanced to slow enemies at the end of its path, and it also has an overpower stun, which if it overpowers, you can stun. So if you were to use that in combination with something like Pulverize, which has the guaranteed overpower every 12 seconds, you could potentially get a free stun every 12 seconds using Enhanced Boulder. We also have the Savage Boulder, which increases the crit chance by 3% each time it deals damage. So like when you're knocking back a target multiple times, it's going to get a nice little crit bonus for each time it knocks them back, which is pretty cool. Give you a little mini game of knocking them away. Rabies is a pretty strong poison damage effect, which spreads to everything. And when I did my Poison Wolf, I did build this, but I didn't use this as my main ability because it's really one of those abilities, just like in Diablo 2, where you bite and you let it do its thing, and then you go and do your thing. And of course, you can increase the poisoning damage that's being dealt. You can also deal its total poisoning damage in 4 seconds, so 6, which speeds it up a little bit. And then you can also make it spread faster, which is pretty cool. Over here in this particular tree, we got the poisoned enemies are slowed by 8%, which is nice if you're going to do the poison build. And then on top of that, we also have poisoned enemies take 10% additional critical strike damage. And then critical strikes with the werewolf skills deal 8% of their base damage as poisoning. All of this works out pretty well for the poisoned wolf. And then finally, we have the bear Trample. Trample got beefed up a little bit recently, and it actually does some pretty good damage now. It was kind of just supposed to be a movement ability for the bear, but now it really kind of dishes out a lot more damage. And basically, you shapeshift into a werebear, you become unstoppable, which means you can't be slowed down or anything, and you charge forward, dealing a pretty decent amount of damage, knocking enemies back. Now, the damage that you deal has been buffed up, but not the damage that you dish out to the targets when they hit a wall. So basically, if you knock a monster back and they hit an object, when you knock them back, they take an additional damage when they hit the wall, and that hasn't changed. But the damage for the actual ability was. Trample deals 150% bonus damage. This bonus damage is reduced by 50% for each enemy hit, so you get more damage, but less if you hit multiple targets. Casting Trample gains 20% base life as Fortify, which kind of signifies it as a defensive ability. And then Casting Trample gains 20 Spirit, so you can turn it either into a generator or a defensive ability. It's an interesting movement ability, and it actually does damage now, so that's kind of cool. Then we got the ultimates. So the ultimates are a little strange, and I did kind of have some thoughts on these. Petrify really is very interesting from a crowd control perspective. It basically just kind of stops everything for 3 seconds, which is interesting. But the ability seems to be on a really long cooldown and doesn't really seem to be as useful as you would think it would be. You can beef it up so the duration goes up from 3 seconds to 4 seconds, which is nice. And then killing an enemy that is petrified grants 25 spirit is also pretty nice. But the duration is pretty low, and unless you've got some nice one-shots abilities, you might have a little bit of trouble making that happen. We also have some passive abilities in here, so nature magic damage against elites. Nature magic consumes spirit, it heals you for 1% of your life. And then we've got the earth skills, increase damage to vulnerable enemies. Your storm skills deal 4% increased damage to enemies that are stunned, immobilized, or knocks back. There's a lot of that going on in this tree. So if you're stunning enemies on a regular basis, immobilizing them, knocking back the enemies, you're going to be able to get some pretty nice damage bumps here and there for that. Nature magic skills deal 2% increased damage. Triple this bonus if an earth skill is the next skill cast after a storm skill. So this is one if you're using both earth and storm skills together, which is neat. We also have Cataclysm, which basically just has a big storm come, twisters shooting out everywhere. It doesn't really seem as useful as I thought it would be. And then when I used it a couple times here and there, it's really random, it's really chaotic, and sometimes it doesn't even hit anything, which is strange. I'm not really 100% sure on this one. You can beef it up so the duration is increased by about 2 seconds, and then you can also make it make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds as well. Lacerate is an interesting one for the werewolf, which basically has him run around dishing out damage to a bunch of enemies within a target area. Kind of similar to the way that the monk's ability worked in Diablo 3, where seven-sided strike. And I wasn't super impressed with this one, but I also couldn't get access to the passives on this one, which allow you to heal yourself for 3% of your maximum life, and then also gets you a critical strike bonus of 150% increased damage, which is pretty nice. So I didn't really get the full, feel of it. But it definitely did feel a lot like the monk's seven-sided strike. Then we got the passives, which give you different effects depending on whether you're shapeshifting into multiple forms, and fortifies you. And then we also get the one that upon shapeshifting into a werewolf or werebear, gain 4% damage reduction against elites. These are just passives that you can customize your character with, really. You might not choose this one if you're a full werebear or a full werewolf, but you would probably choose this one if you're a werebear/werewolf. Grizzly Rage was interesting. You turn into a big hulking monster bear, and you run around and you dish out extra damage, and you can extend the form by getting kills. So the more kills you get, the longer it lasts, up to a certain number of seconds, and it's kind of neat. You also become unstoppable when you're in the Grizzly Rage form if you choose the passive, and then you can also increase your base life as Fortify, or gain base life as Fortify as well while it's active. So it's a kind of an interesting, just like big monster form. We also have some more passives which give you defense. Let's see. Fortify, when you gain, increase the amount of Fortify you gain from all sources. So if you're going to do like a Fortify build, this will help you build even more Fortify. We also have when you are stunned or immobilized, you gain Fortify, and then reduce the duration of the control parrying effects by 3%. Triple this when you have Fortify. As you can see, this is a very Fortify-based tree, so if you're going to be running Fortify, there's a lot of interesting things in here you could potentially choose to make your character more tanky. And then, of course, at the end of this tree, we have the capstones, and each one of the capstones is specific to the like build that you might want to do. Like the Perfect Storm is definitely one that is specifically for a Storm Druid, and then we have the Nature's Fury, which is for a Storm/Earth Druid, and then we have the Earthen Might, which is for the Earth Druid specifically, the Lupine Ferocity, which is definitely for the Werewolf, the Ursine Strength, which is definitely for the Werebear. And then we finally have the Bestial Rampage, which is actually a bonus for both. So if you're traveling, if you're transforming back and forth between the forms a lot, this one allows you to get some bonuses depending on which form you're in, and also giving you that bonus for a certain period of time. So it says after being a werewolf form for 2.5 seconds, you gain attack speed for 15 seconds. So if you're constantly swapping and swapping back and forth, you get a nice attack speed bonus and a nice damage bonus. Overall, I definitely felt like the Druid was one of the more versatile classes in terms of what you could potentially do. I mean, you can be a caster, you can be a melee, you can be a ranged, you can be freaking like wind, earth, freaking poison. Like, I mean, there's a build in there for just about every kind of thing that you might want to actually do for the Druid. You can mix and match skills. You can obviously mix and match melee and range skills. You can mix and match werebear and werewolf skills. And honestly, I had a lot of fun theory crafting builds on the Druid because there were just so many various options that you could take. I'm very interested to try out a full Storm Druid eventually. The unfortunate side effect of having so many cool things that you can do, though, means that at level 25 in the beta, and definitely at level 20 in the server slam, it was very difficult to actually like create the builds that I wanted to create because I was just limited in the number of skill points that I had access to. However, I do see some very interesting build opportunities in the future when I have more skill points, and also I have access to the totems. And that's something that we can talk about really quickly, but we don't have access to, is that the Druid has access to these pretty cool totems that offer some very interesting benefits that can change the way that you're playing your character. Things like being able to heal yourself when you crit, things like being able to shoot out lightning when monsters are immobilized, and all sorts of other cool things. Some of them are just basic buffs like plus to your spirit or whatnot, but a lot of them I think are what I would consider build changing buffs that I'm hoping obviously we're eventually going to get access to. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when it's just me talking for like 30 minutes on the frickin' Druid for Diablo 4. And do look forward to more content because I'm going to be going over lots of things as it comes closer and closer to the launch, which is June the 1st. As always, thanks for watching, and keep watching.